Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 153. And this episode, we are looking back a little bit because we wanted to talk about the recently released book, Video Game of the Year by Jordan Miner. And to better talk about that, we have the author here. Mr. Miner, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Excited.
Jordan, I'm so excited to have you on. This book is great.
Thank you.
So in the introduction of the book, you talk about how, and I think you meant this both as a gag, but also very seriously, that gamers love nothing more than dissent and argument, and like especially to argue about what was the greatest game of all time, of the year. And like this book is kind of your way of not only sharing your opinion on it and the opinions of others, but like kind of just engaging in that conversation, which I think is absolutely true. I think some of my favorite podcasts are Game of the Year shows because I mostly like to get mad at everyone's choices that aren't mine.
Yep.
When putting this together, this is mostly completely like your choices, right? Was every year obvious to you because of those games that you loved, or did you really have to like narrow it down? Did you even have to fight yourself a little?
So no, not everything was obvious. I think what helped is that it's this whole structure where it's one game per year that keeps from being too... Imagine just a best games of all time list. You can see that being very front loaded with like older games or...
It shows a bias.
Yeah. So having it be in this one per year format, I think forces a lot of interesting decisions, which is a reason I was excited for that. And then something else that kind of helped guide me in the selection process, which was done before even... Part of even just pitching the book was having the list pretty much settled. Something that also helped me as well is that the book is really meant to be a video game history book, more than just talking about what's like the best game. It's really about trying to talk about the history of video games through the lens of these individual games. So I wanted to pick a collection of games that collectively could tell as much of that history as I could. So I wanted to get as much genre variety in there, as much publisher variety, just different kinds of games, as many different topics as I could fit in there. That also kind of helped keep things from being like too redundant, I guess. I could be like, well, here is, I talk about System Shock in 1999, so I don't need to talk about BioShock in 2007. I could talk about Rock Band in 2007.
Yeah, and I feel like what BioShock did was standing on the shoulders of System Shock too, so it absolutely makes a lot of sense there. And because we haven't said this yet on the episode, listener, if this is your first time hearing about this book, A, fantastic book. B, it does cover a chosen game of the year from 1977 to 2022. It is a fairly comprehensive width and breadth, I suppose, and as one might guess, sight unseen, the first game is Pong. Now, was that sort of what made 1977 the start there? Because as you note in the book, Pong isn't the first video game. It's not the first a lot of things, but it is a coalescence of so many other factors. Was that sort of what made that the starting point for you?
I mean, that's not even the year that Pong came out. Pong came out in 72.
Fair enough.
So it was also that's when the Atari 2600 came out with Video Olympics. It's like kind of a collection of Pong variants. I mean, Pong is a game that people have heard of as very old. That it had this Atari 2600 version was useful because then I could start with that kind of first home console that I think most people would have had any kind of familiarity with, unless you had like a Magnavox Odyssey or whatever. And then, just starting in 77 versus like an even earlier year, it just makes it easier to go from Pong and Space Invaders and, Asteroid, Speed Freak, Pac-Man. It makes the beginning of the book have games that people have heard of like right away without these kind of weird gaps of kind of more primitive prototype kind of stuff.
It kind of starts with the idea of bringing the video games home and what that was.
Yeah.
I love the choices because, like I said at the start of the episode, the reaction you want to get out of people is you want to tell this history, but you also want people to go, wait, he picked this for that year? And like, for me, my favorite, and I don't disagree, is Fortnite for 2017 because like, that's the year the Switch came out. That's the year Breath of the Wild came out. And like, that was almost everyone's unanimous game of the year that year on a lot of major sites and all this other stuff. And so for you to pick Fortnite, which is a very influential game to this day since it came out, is just so funny to me. But the description you have of like wanting to also tell the story of gaming, we don't quite have Link in Fortnite yet, but I still don't doubt that's coming eventually. But I love that you've used sections of the book to tell that history. and also tell very personal stories about why these things are important to you, or bring in people to tell their stories. Was that always part of the plan too for pulling this book together? Because you have some incredible folks within and around the games industry also writing small essays and sections of the book. Was that always part of this process? Did you always want to share the voice of the broader community as well?
Yeah, that was from the beginning. Me and my agent and the publisher, even just discussing what the book would be as we were selling it, that was always part of the idea, that we would get this whole community element, all these other writers to get their takes in there. Because, yeah, it's not even about necessarily what is the correct pick. It's just about the discussion and having these other viewpoints and having also like counters to my opinions. I felt a lot more comfortable being like, I don't like Souls games at all. Once we got those blurbs about Bloodborne and Demon Souls from Timur and Scott Benson about how they love those games, and I think their writing about it was really excellently argued. So just to make the book more comprehensive, included getting all these people to also just bring even more games discussed.
Now that the book is done and complete, later I'm going to ask you about 2023. We'll get to that, even though we're only halfway through.
It's the obvious question.
That's the obvious question. But are there any games that you look back that you go, oh, I wish I could have talked about that one, or like things you remembered after the fact, you're like, oh, I wish I could, or were there ones that you couldn't work in, but you wanted to, but it just didn't fit right for the flow of the book?
I really wish I could have got Burnout Paradise in the book somehow. I love that game.
Nice.
I think it's like a top tier racing game in that it cares about the things that I care about in a racing game, which is destruction and speed. I have no fondness for real cars or simulation stuff.
Yeah.
So I really love that game a whole lot. But I ended up picking the first Forza Horizon as a runner-up in 2012 because that also ended up being a way to sort of, that game kind of is best of all worlds. It's more arcadey than like Gran Turismo, but it still kind of has a foot in that sim world. It has real cars, and it's a really big Microsoft franchise. So that ended up being the way to kind of touch on that. So that'd be the thing. Where I would cut a game where I feel like if I could talk about more things in another pick, and also if that helped out the timeline as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious. So obviously there are a ton of games on this list, old retro games, of course, as you get more modern, newer games. Did you replay any of these games and like prep for the book, or did you kind of go off of just research? How did you kind of refamiliarize yourself with all of these games as you were talking about them for the book?
It was a mix. I would try to play as much as I could that I had access to easily and legally. A lot of it is memories. A game like Speed Freak, I don't really have much hands-on with myself, but that was just through research. And yeah, I also try to make sure, even when I'm relying on memory, to find like sources that I could cite if, there's no footnote in the book. But like for myself, to be able to have something I go back and cite if I needed to was useful as well, to not just rely on what I remembered. Also for the fact checkers too. But yeah, it was a mix of all that stuff.
What was the journey like for you to kind of look to the games that were older than you? Because I think for anybody that is a gamer of whatever age, whatever stripe, what generation you grew up in, and it kind of becomes obvious to anybody older than you, like, oh, you didn't grow up with a Super Nintendo, did you? Or anything earlier than that. And what was it for you to go and find those and do that?
I think actually the older chapters were some of the easier chapters to write because they're older and we have a lot more hindsight now as to why they're important and like what they've done. The Donkey Kong chapter, the whole structure of that chapter is here's all the events of history that like pivot on Donkey Kong.
Yeah.
The entire console market as we know it.
Yeah.
So that was, I think, easier in a sense, actually, the older ones. It was really more the newer games that even if I had played them very recently, I felt was more difficult to try to predict their importance. So I ended up kind of picking. There's a cheating element to some of the later chapters, I think, where I picked Sekiro, but that's really more about Souls games as a whole, and those have had a lot more time to prove their relevance.
It's giving them their moment, their due on the list as it is important.
Right. Or like Animal Crossing, where that's very much tied to like a really specific moment in time with all the pandemic stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's making a through line of history is very much about that, putting context to what it is. Like, there's so many games that get talked about that are, it was a good game, just came out at the wrong time. So that's just as important.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask about that. Like, Animal Crossing, like, it must have felt impossible to do that chapter without talking about COVID, which I think is important to the games industry as a whole as well, because it shook up the games industry in a way that had never been before. But, like, there was no way I feel like you could have even picked something besides Animal Crossing because it was such a cultural event beyond just what's important to video games and what's important to people who play games, because I feel like that game in particular got more people into games who might not have been, or bought a Switch because they couldn't do anything. They couldn't go anywhere. Was that a consideration for a lot of the other games too? Is like, how is this affecting the world around us as well?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, the intersection between games and people's lives was definitely on my mind the entire time. Like a game like Rock Band and the whole plastic instrument stuff.
Or Wii Sports or Pokemon Go.
Wii Sports, yeah, Pokemon Go, exactly. Or Fortnite and Minecraft, like these games that are gigantic. The games that, like, I think people who are hardcore gamers will appreciate a lot of like in-depth stuff in this book, but it's meant to also be like readable by like a mainstream audience. And there's certain games that if they were not in there, they would be like, well, like, why not? Like, I've heard of this.
Yeah.
It'd be a weird omission, right?
Well, I love the fact that, 2012 is The Walking Dead, the Telltale Games series, absolutely important. It was a whole thing where Telltale Games went. Also part of the conversation. 2014, you've got Destiny. We're still talking about Destiny. 2013 was Depression Quest, which is, I think, a fantastic choice and one worth talking about in the history of things. And yet, I feel like that's a deep cut if you're a non-gamer, and this is just something you find on a gamer's coffee table.
Well, I mean, Depression Quest is maybe, but I think Gamergate is something that broke into the mainstream.
But people may not associate that, but this is still important.
Right, that's true. But yeah, I mean, the chapter gets to that as well, and that's another thing. That's another thing that would be, I think, a disingenuous omission if we're talking about like games culture and history. But yeah, also, yeah, just have another indie game in there and to have another kind of like narrative-focused game, and a game that uses that like is very story heavy, but still has interesting mechanics and interesting like mechanical metaphors is something I really appreciate about that game. Of like, your brain won't let you make good choices if you're, like it starts physically stopping you from making better choices. I thought that's a cool just mechanic in that game.
Yeah, and that one made me really happy because very much what we talk about here is games are games and fun is fun, and they don't all have to be one thing or another, and they can tell incredible stories through that. And Depression Quest was something using admittedly limited tools to do something I felt very profound.
And also, you can read the book in any order. I feel you can read whatever chapter you want, but if you read it in order, you can start to see certain kind of through lines happen. One of the early chapters, one of the runner-up picks is Colossal Cave Adventure as like the first text adventure. So then you see that, and then 30 years later, you see how it evolves. So that's another kind of cool experience of reading the book, is seeing that. Again, with these individual games, you get this better sense of this broader scope of history happening.
Yeah. What I really love about this book too is you're mostly celebrating games, but you're not just celebrating games. You also want to talk about the highs and lows of the games industry and like mention Gamergate and other things. It's like, it seems like it was very important to you to take an honest look at gaming. And while you mostly want to celebrate what this hobby that we love, you didn't want to shy away from the darker side and the problems that have come up over the years, since there have been quite a few.
Yeah, I think that's just an important part of being honest and mature in your appreciation of art.
Yeah.
It's just to look at the whole of it. I love movies, but Hollywood is full of freaks.
We're in the middle of
Yes.
several strikes right now.
Yeah. I feel like when you just kind of blindly love something, then you're not even really appreciating it.
Right.
I like to describe this book as like arts criticism, and people think of criticism mostly as like a negative thing.
Right.
But to me, criticism is just about talking about something and talking about how it's doing what it's doing. And a lot of that to me is talking about how it's doing these things that I think are so great about it. And I think understanding how it does those things makes me like it even more and get more excited about it.
Yeah, it engages you. It's an incredible thing.
Yeah.
I have to personally thank you for 1988 and picking one of the most seminal games in the history of video games, Mega Man 2. A lot of people like to fight me on it that 3 is actually the best game, which maybe, but I think what I love also about that chapter and all the chapters, but I really noticed it in that one, is the art direction of the book. So for every chapter, you have this great illustration, usually putting like an actual person in the shot with like either the Robot Masters or whatever else. How did the art direction and the design of the book come together?
So that's all thanks to the publisher. The publisher is Abrams Books, specifically the Abrams Image imprint. So they do a lot of really awesome like art books and stuff like that. They did the Comedy Bang Bang book that came out a few months ago. They just have a lot of expertise in that aspect of creating a book. So that was why it was so cool to link up with them for this project. And so for the illustrations are by Ren McDonald, who's a New York-based cartoonist, who actually I met for the first time not that long ago, even though it's been like a year since we hired him onto the project. So what happened was, so again, the publisher just kind of being good at this and kind of having inroads into these different art communities. They presented me with a list of illustrators to pick from, and Ren was my top pick, like by far. And I'm super glad that he was available to do it, and we got him in. Once we got him in, he then did some kind of test drawings for different ways to take it. And what we ended up doing was a mix of both that you see in the book, where, like you described, some of them, like Mega Man 2, is these characters that are sort of in the world of the game. Those scenes are cool. I think they're kind of dynamic and exciting, like they got like sucked into the game or something. But what I also like, that you also have illustrations of the characters playing the game, and those are really cool because they let you see, like, you know, in the Mario 64 chapter, it's 1996, so there's like a Beanie Baby there. But also you can like see the hardware. You can see the N64 controller. You can see like the Xbox controller, like the, you know, the Rock Band drums. So I think having that, the representation of video game hardware visually in the book too, I think was also very important. I'm glad that we got that in there as well.
Yeah, and it shows, again, context as far as the immersion goes. Street Fighter II showcased the arcade cabinet where, yeah, you could absolutely have it being you're fighting Blanca or something, but I think because that coin-op arcade experience and getting it home was so crucial for it. I mean, there's other ways to go about it. I can't think of a better one.
Right, I mean, because video games are interactive, and a big part of the interactivity is that sort of tactile, physical element. It's not just, you know, software. So yeah, those kind of like sense memories and stuff. I think it also just adds to the nostalgia.
Yeah, for sure. So to make you play favorites for a moment,
Sure.
There are many.
That's the whole book.
That's the whole book. There are a lot of games on this list. Too many games, some might say. How? If you had to pick one game from the entire book as like, this is the game that means the most to me, especially after all of your research and everything you've done, is there one game that stands out as like, this is the most important game to me on this list? Or is it too hard to pick because of the narrowing down process?
I could answer this a couple different ways. My personal favorite game of all time is StarCraft, and that is relegated to a runner-up pick in 98.
Yeah,
I was actually going to ask, was there a game not on the list that means the most to you? Because they're, again, personal over history.
Right, so yeah, I felt it was more important to talk about Metal Gear Solid that year. But I love StarCraft. I love Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. I'm really happy with how that chapter turned out. I just love that game. I guess also, I really enjoy, I mean, I think Super Meat Boy is a cool game, but I really like that chapter because I like how it's another example of using that game to talk about some sort of broader trends. In that the Super Meat Boy chapter talks about Xbox Live, arcade, indie era stuff, but it also talks about Newgrounds and Flash gaming and that whole scene and community that I've been really fond of for a long time, and it's kind of on the verge of being forgotten.
Yeah.
As you know, as Flash is destroyed. So that is probably maybe one of my favorite chapters just because of the topic.
Yeah, I mean, I have high hopes for the new Alien Hominid game, if nothing else, because it keeps that culture alive. Dan Paladin, one of the more influential people during that era, like continuing to make games makes me so happy, especially since it's been so long since Castle Crashers. And, well, I think the most recent one was Pit People. I can't.
Oh, Pit People. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I remember
Which
that,
was a great game, but didn't like hit the heights that a lot of their previous games had hit. And so I'm so glad that we're returning Alien Hominid, which was arguably one of their most popular titles ever. It was definitely the first. But you're right. That era of gaming, Flash gaming, kind of is disappearing. So to have it chronicled in this book along with indie games and the rise of indie games, I think is so important. Because like Super Meat Boy, bringing that up, back then I didn't know the term indie game existed, right? Like the Xbox Live era, like I think of Splosion Man and Missplosion Man, two incredible puzzle platformers. But like if someone had said, oh, those are indie games, I'm like, they're what? They're games. Like I didn't know there's a specific term. Whereas now you can't walk 10 feet without tripping over an indie game, which is great. I love the indie scene, but like back then it was such a moment in time and you capture it so well in the book.
I mean, even also just going back to Alien Hominid too. I mean, Tom Fulp, the founder of Newgrounds, was in the book, and he talked about how he, in helping to make Alien Hominid, he was inspired by Gunstar Heroes, which is another favorite of mine. So again, that's another way to see how he's inspired by that game, and then kind of helps create this whole new, Newgrounds Flash scene that has now inspired other creators. And now you see also games I feel very inspired by Meat Boy, and they're sort of like, what's it called? Masocore, I think people call those kind of platformers.
That's one of the names.
Yeah.
Like that one I see it come up a bunch. It's one of the genres they haven't settled yet.
Look, if we can't settle Metroidvania, we're never going to settle any other genre.
What's wrong with Metroidvania? A lot. A lot is wrong with it, but that's fine.
We could do a whole episode on that.
We did.
It's true. I think also what I love is that some of the years you throw such curveballs that I would agree are the most influential. Like Rock Band, we've mentioned a few times, and like that came out the same year as Mass Effect, one of my favorite games of all time. But like I think Mass Effect changed a lot in games within a certain lane, but I feel like Rock Band is the more influential game on the whole because like the plastic instrument craze, which you could argue is dead now, although there is a current Rock Band running and there are some other things, but like
I still got a guitar.
I feel like Rock Band is one of those games that if you were to tell maybe someone 10 years from now about it, they'd be like, "A what? Plastic instruments?" Like I even feel now that's kind of like alien to much younger gamers. Whereas for us, it was our whole lives between Guitar Hero and Rock Band. Like it was everywhere and like everyone played it.
A lot of us, high school and college, that was, what we did.
Yeah, I mean, I love DJ Hero, and that was right as it was all falling apart. So
Yeah.
I didn't play it a ton, but every time was so fun.
it was great. It had like, because they were making their own mashups for it, and also just kind of let them expand the kind of genres of music they could have in there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And like one of the things that sometimes pops up in indie games now that I wish more people did, though I understand why they don't, is utilizing some of those old controllers in how they make their games. I would need to look it up to remember it, but I know there is a music game that has come out in the last year that advertised itself as works with Guitar Hero controllers. Why? Because we're insane. That's why, and we're masochists. And I feel like stuff like DJ Hero, old Beatmania controllers, any of those, you could do a lot of fun games with that. But you need to remember it, you need to develop for it, people need to have it. And those are aspects of the market, an aspect of the history. And I think remembering is a big part of that. In your own research and in compiling the first proposal list that you had for the publishers, did you have any moments of like, oh wow, that was that long ago? Or going like, okay, what was the hot game of 1990? Oh Jesus, like a lot came out here. Like, were there interesting rediscoveries for you before you brought them to us, the public?
That was another thing where there was an interesting split between older stuff and newer stuff, in that going through the old games, the pace, the momentum of changes happening from year to year was like crazy to see in retrospect.
Oh, yeah.
Of just like how much things could change in just like a 5-year period of just like this game is 2 blocks on a screen to now we're doing like pseudo 3D stuff to like full on first person shooters.
Like 91 to 96 was nuts.
Yeah. So that was really just in the writing, because I wrote it all in order. So just in the writing process, that felt very fast and very exciting. And then you hit, kind of like 360 late 2000s era. And I mean, they're still great games, but it starts to feel like stuff sort of slows down in terms of like how dramatic some of these changes are. So at that point, I'm like, oh, I guess I'm almost done, right? We're back to the present. But then it's like, no, there's still like kind of 14 years left to go.
It's that 80s, 90s, and today on the radio kind of thing.
Yeah, like a lot of the book that feels like the end of the book to me is like a third of it ultimately.
Well, yeah, and I feel like the diversity of like the last 5 years or so is important because otherwise there are a lot of games now. I love how advanced gaming has gotten, but a lot of AAA titles look the same, not in a bad way, but like they all look really real, which is great. But like you could see a monotony in the design if you picked Horizon and Last of Us and like, which are all great games and deserving of praise, but aesthetically they look like real people, right? And like they're all the same, but instead you go with like Fortnite and Pokemon Go and Smash Ultimate, but you still call out some of those games like The Witcher and Sekiro, but they still very much have their own very specific design that I think is important talking about those years. And I feel like that had to have been a conscious choice to not just like pick the tentpole titles from PlayStation and Xbox.
Yeah, it's not just sales figures.
Right. Yeah, I mean, to call out PlayStation, yeah. I mean, I just picked the Uncharted 2 chapter to sort of talk about how I feel like that game is the patient zero for Sony's entire kind of blockbuster aesthetic now, which I personally I'm not the most into.
We're all tired.
Yeah. And then, Halo for what it means to Xbox, even to this day, although Halo Infinite, people have fallen off.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you said, like in picking these newer games, it had to be games I just had some sort of take on and that I thought could talk about just a new thing, which got a little bit harder as the games become more similar. And again, as there's just less time to see their potential influence.
So we mentioned earlier there are guest sections and essays from different people throughout and around the games industry. Is there anyone you asked that you're surprised said yes?
Most of them. Honestly. I mean, the goal was to have just at least one person for a chapter, and it's basically twice that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm really happy that Tom Falk is in the book for that Newgrounds kind of connection. Yeah. I'm really happy. Again, Scott Benson, Night in the Woods is a great game.
Yeah.
He's a great writer, and it was super cool to get that. But I mean, I don't want to play favorites here. I appreciate everybody who contributed to it. Some of them are my close coworkers or people I went to college with, or just other writers that I've just admired from listening to their podcast for like 15 years. I mean, I appreciate Jason Schreier has written some excellent video game history books, and so to get him in there was pretty validating. I mean, I think we were saying off mic, but you listened to me on Remap, and getting Patrick Klepek in the book was great too.
Yeah.
This is an audio podcast, but I'm an African American man, so the amount of black people that I got into this book, I'm also very personally satisfied by.
Sure.
But yeah, there's NYU game design students in this book, veteran developers, there's writers, the whole scope of it collectively, I'm really pleased by. And I think as much as I like my own writing in the book, I think with my writing and the art and these contributors blurbs, I really think this is like a top tier video game book.
And I love that this book and the viewpoints represent the diversity in the game space that I think we want. Because, I mean, we have to be realistic that it's not there yet. The game space gets more and more diverse every day. But from as recently as the stuff going on with Final Fantasy 16 not having barely any people of color in it because they decided not to. And like all of those kinds of things are still happening within the games industry. So I feel like a book like this that does have these diverse viewpoints really kind of can show a light of the kind of thing that we want to actually happen in the game space and kind of lean in that direction.
For sure. And so many of the writers are people who are online writers and their careers have been on the internet. Their writing could be deleted by a corporation at any moment. So I was very excited as an internet writer to be in a book. I think that was also a very appealing pitch to other writers as well.
Well, and especially considering where video games are nowadays with the conversation, not just the writers who are very much at risk of, with mass layoffs and with the shrinking of the space of all the thoughts and the takes and analysis and criticism disappearing, the games themselves as well. So any amount of talking about this, getting people's voices, getting their viewpoints, and just getting the memories about these titles out there is crucial.
Yeah, game preservation was definitely on my mind just in the creation of this and what I think is important about it.
I mean, it's hard to ignore it now, right? People are so much more vocal about it. There are incredible people doing work online and, of course, in writing in all sorts of places about how keeping this stuff alive is more important than just talking about it, but actually having these games accessible, which so many of them are not. And I mean, that's an important part of the conversation, too. You feature a ton of Nintendo games in here, and I love Nintendo. We're big Nintendo fanboys here, but, like, not the greatest company when it comes to preservation. And I think it's important to showcase these games and remind people these were important games. And yes, some of these big names you can play on Switch for an extra cost, but you can't play all of them and you can't even easily access all of them. And while, of course, we don't advocate for stealing games or emulating anything here,
Publicly.
I think it's important to showcase this stuff and remind people that like games are finite and they can go away and disappear unless we continue to uplift them and find ways to preserve them.
And that's even just for like famous games.
Yeah,
right.
Like, the picks on the list are very well known for the most part. And that was another thing that was cool about the contributor essays was that I gave them a pretty wide canvas to just pick whatever game you want to talk about, just whatever you feel passionate about. And a lot of them pick games that they're very offbeat and cool and worth talking about, but then because they're not very famous or then especially hard to get your hands on. Chris Franklin wrote about this like 93 Jurassic Park game. It was fascinating reading about like how it was such a primitive like first person shooter all of a sudden. But then it's like, how are you gonna get your hands on this now? How are you gonna play Incredible Crisis?
Yeah.
Reading Incredible Crisis made me so happy. But all of it was true. And you're right, it's all of those little moments. This same day on Twitter, X, whatever, posted a picture of your book with some Game Gears because it was just like, no Game Gear game is important enough to be on a Game of the Year list, but preservation's important. Also, I just wanted to show how stupid it was that I have 4 non-working Game Gears in my life. But all of those memories, all of those pieces are as much a part of the fabric, and I love that you have given a space for that to be showcased.
I just love that picture. I love seeing pictures of the book, and the more props, the better.
Fair enough. Love it. Thank you. Glad to hear it.
I think we've put this off long enough, but obviously the book ends with 2022. We are in 2023 and not quite done yet as of when we're recording this, but you must have an idea. Could you right now pick your game of the year for this year, or would you have to, like, have you played your game of the year yet, or are you still waiting to see?
I would doubt I would enjoy any game more than Zelda this year.
Yeah.
I would pick Zelda. It would also rectify I didn't get to pick Breath of the Wild because of Fortnite, so
Right.
it would fix that mistake. I think I would have a take on that game about how it represents Nintendo's kind of like toy making sensibilities really well, even in like in a AAA game. How much that game really cares about just like putting stuff together and just messing around, and how the ability is even named after an old toy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it would be, I guess, like the toy of the year would be the little subhead for the Tears of the Kingdom chapter. But I will say, though, Baldur's Gate 3, which I've not played yet, people seem really into it in ways that sound really interesting and exciting. I think that also might have a chance for this year. I think right now it's those two.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
I mean, the most fun thing about the Game of the Year take is to do that mid-year, like, well, up until now, this game is my Game of the Year. I mean, I've gone on record saying I've had like 2 or 3 games of the year, though Hi-Fi Rush still stands tall. But
Yeah, that's on my list too, for sure.
But Sea of Stars is just around the corner, and you're talking to Chrono Trigger's #1 fan. So, like, it is going to be very difficult to beat that game if it's half as good as I expect it to be. And I think that's the fun of these kinds of conversations. It's easy to be like, Last of Us 2, pinnacle of gaming, best game ever made. Which
No, it's not.
It's not.
Absolutely no.
But shout out to Janet Garcia for arguing why it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. But that's the thing is, like, I think arguing with a sense of self is so much more fun in this space than arguing with self-importance. And I think this book celebrates that. What you set out and what you said in that introduction is really very much alive and well in this book. And I think important to gaming and gaming culture because, the online space kind of sucks. And especially when I'm trying to talk about your favorites, I can't tell you how many times I've tweeted, Yakuza 0 is my example. Everyone needs to play Yakuza 0. It's one of the best video games ever made, and not enough people have played it. But every time I share it, there's one person who goes, yeah, I didn't like it. Okay. You want to tell me why you don't agree? Great. Give me a dissertation. But like just saying you didn't like a thing, it's like, this isn't the fun of that. And I like that this game encourages, I'm afraid to use the word discourse, but like positive discourse about games, which is just gets harder to find outside of community discords and groups of friends and, hanging out in person.
And makes a hard copy of it.
Yeah, which I think is really important to the game space and like encouraging positive conversation about video games instead of just tearing each other down.
I was just thinking about Yakuza and how I could give you that dissertation.
Oh my God, please. Like
how they took a game, they looked at Yakuza and they decided, you know what? With our reboot, Like a Dragon, what Yakuza needs to be is even slower.
It's just one of those things that like I discovered it during the pandemic. I was displaced due to a fire. I've told this story a bajillion times on the podcast, but like I was unemployed at the time, and a friend had done an episode of Side Quest, the subseries within this podcast, about it, and talked about how you can get a chicken to join your real estate empire, and was like, all right, I need to play this game. And ended up loving it and then playing the entire franchise over the next like 2 or 3 years. But now I've become that person. Like online, I'm like, well, have you played Yakuza? You should play Yakuza. It's a great game. And I feel like
it's in the book. 0 is in the book.
Yeah.
It's the runner-up for 2015.
Yeah.
So.
And I feel like those kinds of games are so important as well. And I'm so glad they're featured in different ways in the book because we all have a game that we will die for that other people are like, yeah, okay. Sure, whatever. I don't care. And I think that's important too in the identity of loving video games is like really just going to bat for things that people might think you're crazy to love because they mean something to you. Because I think like movies and music and a lot of other art, it's all open to our interpretation. And this book showcases that. There's a quality bar for graphics and sound design and whatever else. But why you love something is so ethereal. And I think this book really is mostly about the games you love each year more than just what's the best game ever made that year,
Yeah, there's somewhat an element of objectivity with some of the historical importance. But yeah, like you said, like the discussion is the point. It's not about who's right or wrong. It's just talking about it. And when you care about it, the discussion is richer and more interesting.
Yeah, I find in a lot of art discussions and a lot of customizable game choices and anything where choice and subjectivity matters, it's not what's the best choice, it's what are people most passionate about can often be the best argued or something that's going to actually get you to take a look. Whether you love it or not after they've told you about it, that's what gets the ball rolling, and I think that's so important. With that in mind, are there any games that you would never conceive of putting in this book or a book like it, but you would go to bat for every single day?
Oh, I love Donkey Kong Jungle Beat on the GameCube.
Yes, let's go.
That game is phenomenal for all sorts of reasons, but it wouldn't belong. It wouldn't belong here. But Donkey Kong Country 2 is in the book, so there you get some representation there.
And those are basically the same game.
Right.
Yeah, well, no, one has bongo controllers.
Oh, man.
And is stronger for it.
Yes.
I want to see a follow-up book of best peripheral of the year, and it's just every year a video game peripheral that came out. I mean, towards the 90s and 2000s, there were so many. I mean, you think about Mad Catz and all of those like third-party companies that a lot of them don't even exist anymore. There must have been an off-brand version of the bongos, right? I feel like there had to have been.
I don't know if there was actually.
Just use a dive kick controller.
Yeah, basically.
Right, exactly.
At this point.
That's another great game that would not be in this book.
Right.
But
I feel like that one's its own honorable mention because when you think of the history of fighting game meta and everything else and how it just went, we don't need combos. Dive, kick. Have fun, everybody.
yeah, it's all just mind games. And,
Right.
yeah.
It stripped so much bare and, it didn't completely shift a paradigm or nothing was ever the same again. But I think a lot of people were not the same again after Dive Kick.
I went to school in Chicago. I was really much coming up in that Chicago indie dev scene when I was kind of starting off doing games reporting. And yeah, I was going to dive kick tournaments and stuff like that. So, I have a soft spot for that game.
Absolutely, yeah.
Before we start to wrap up, I would love to know a little bit about your video game history. So obviously you know a lot about games. You've been writing about games for a while. What was your first video game console, and what was like the first game that was like your game of the year? Like the game that meant the world to you that you played early on?
So my older sister had a Super Nintendo that I definitely remember playing. And so I have really fond memories for the first Donkey Kong Country and Mortal Kombat we had on that, and Contra 3, the Alien Wars on Super Nintendo. So those are all pretty formative memories for me. I think my first console that was like mine was probably the Nintendo 64 with Star Fox 64 and Diddy Kong Racing. I liked a whole lot. And, the first Smash Brothers. But then, when you start getting to kind of GameCube era, then I'm like getting like, all right, I'm like really into this. I'm playing Melee a whole lot. I'm playing Donkey Kong Jungle Beat a whole lot, that kind of stuff. And then it's really the Wii. It's the DS. It's the DS is the first console that I'm like aware existed before it's out. I'm like following game news now. I can see what's happening. I'm reading magazines. That was the first E3 I saw. Was the E3 that they showed the DS off at. So it's when you get into that mid-2000s era is when I'm like really into it. I'm really following it. I'm really like, people are writing about this for their career. That's something that I would like to do.
You're forming those capital O opinions.
Yes, takes. So yeah, and then the Wii is a console I was so hyped for that I'm like, I cannot wait for this to come out. I'm going to midnight launches for like Smash Brothers Brawl. And then I'm like writing for Wii fan sites also. That's why I'm kind of like doing the writing angle of it. So that's like 2007, 2008. I mean, can I just keep going with my own
you might as well just give us the timeline.
Keep it going, absolutely.
Yeah, so then it's like 2008, 9-ish. I'm reviewing iPhone games, actually. That was a market that had a lot of need for people to have opinions on games because there were just so many of them.
Right.
So that's when I started getting paid. I'm reviewing a lot of iPhone games in like senior year of high school. A lot of college recruiters found that really impressive that I was getting paid to write about video games and that I was so focused on this goal. So I go to Northwestern University, which is a very good journalism school in Chicago, in Evanston, Illinois. I'm doing that. I'm just learning how to be an overall journalist covering topics I don't care about at all, but it's important to at least have some familiarity with to be a more well-rounded writer.
Right.
And then they have an internship program, and I get put at PC Mag through that program, and I still work at PC Mag.
It's amazing. How young were you when you realized, I could get paid to put words down about video games? Was it really young, or was it not until like
It was the DS.
high school? It was the DS era.
Yeah, I would have been like 13, 12 when that was all happening. I was born in 91. So.
Oh, I'm so old. Anyway, as long as Charles Hart exists in the gaming space, like no one will be too young because he doesn't remember anything before the Wii, and I feel like as long as Charles is around, I'll feel a little bit.
I did an interview with my college magazine, and so we got to see when I was at school, I was covering the Wii U launch.
And again, talking about how fast technology moves and the cycles of consoles and things, and it's that sort of, I remember this console. You talk to somebody who is a peer or something, and it's just, really, that's like a baby's toy or whatever it is, and you're just, oh dear. Well, I suppose that's what this is, and okay, cool, but I need to go and crack my back for a minute. And
Is you're gonna really feel that with like the failed consoles, too, because they'll just have no point of reference for it. We're like, I feel bad for people when I'm like, I don't have any TurboGrafx 16 familiarity,
Right?
Or I didn't play a Neo Geo really. So when future generations are really like, what in the heck is a PlayStation Vita? Like, are you telling me like what is that? That did not exist. I'm like, you're right. It might as well have not.
Unfortunately, I love that handheld so much. But yeah, and those ones where, I've never played a TurboGrafx 16, certainly never when it was a thing, but I definitely remember reading about it, contemporary, whatever else. And that thing of like having no frame of reference, which there again, having some history is great. Kids today or of the future, whatever, you don't need to know everything that's out there, but a little bit of context is always important.
John Romero just put out an autobiography called Doom Guy from the same publisher as this book, and the same people worked on it. So I feel fine doing this ad for him. And it's great. Yeah, he talks about coming up, making these shareware games that I was not playing, but was really cool and important. So.
It was a weird time. 3.5A floppies and 5 1/4. I don't even remember. One thing I've noticed about this book, there are some games that you could have played on handheld, but for the most part, these are console or PC games. Is there an idea to possibly look at the greatest handheld games every year? Or is that just, now obviously there could be some.
You can always go deeper.
Right. You can always go deeper. You have a ton of essays, but like in the flagship titles, there weren't a ton of handheld games, except I guess one of the most popular handheld games of all time, Pokemon Go. Was that a conscious thing, or is that saving for later, or is it just your experience or the experience of the research?
I think that's just kind of how it ended up kind of shaking out.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe unfortunately, that just ended up being the games. I mean, the Tetris chapter talks about how its importance to the Game Boy.
Sure.
So that, that touches on the handheld aspect. And then there's a great essay on WarioWare in the book. I mean, maybe this could be me as well. I've never bought into this notion that like, and maybe this is why I like the Switch so much. I've never really bought into the idea of only certain games need to be for handhelds and certain games need for consoles.
Sure.
And I do appreciate how handhelds have had really great libraries on their own and have helped provide a space for kind of more modest development that doesn't have to compete in the console space. To me, it's just games are games.
Right.
Absolutely.
So
that totally makes sense.
And then, so many great console games then are ported to handheld, like the Game Boy Advance had a whole great SNES library.
Yeah.
Totally.
Oh, I mean, even think about the fact that, Resident Evil 4, Game of the Year 2005, has an Android port and an iPod port. I think it was on the iPod Touch and then got ported to other things as well. So there again, you get that context and idea of, it's an incredible game. How did you first play it? And that's just like a question to the greater gaming public. And how does that color your knowledge of it, your concept of it, or your answer on when it came out? But yeah, there's so many different ways to get at a lot of games.
Yeah. I mean, Brain Age is in the book as well.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty important DS game. Fire Emblem Awakening for 3DS is in the book.
Yeah. The last thing I want to ask before we wrap up, a question that folks love hearing after they've just labored over something, is what they're going to do next. But this is an incredible book. It's an incredible accomplishment. Do you have any desire or want to write another book after this at some point? Is that something that you don't want to think about for a long time because of getting this book out the door?
As for what I'm going to do next, I think when people are listening to this, I'm on a plane to Europe for a vacation and honeymoon. So that's what I'm doing next.
Fantastic.
But I mean, I'm really proud of this book. Getting even just one book out is huge. That's not at all guaranteed. I've had my agent since 2016, and this is my first book. So I'm very grateful to just get this out there. And I hope people enjoy it and pick it up, which would definitely make it a lot easier to do another thing if there's demand and support. But I would love to keep doing this. I love writing. I love video games. I love articulating my thoughts on them. I definitely have other ideas for other projects. And I'm working on a project right now, actually, that I can't really tease any more than that, other than that it exists.
Love it.
That's amazing. Well, Jordan, thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with us. I want to just give a quick shout out to Taylor & Co. Books, which is in Brooklyn, New York on Cortelyou Road. Taylor, the owner of the bookshop, I came to him saying that I really wanted this book for this podcast, and not only did he order me a copy, he got a copy and got a bunch of copies for the store. So if you are in Brooklyn and you are near Taylor & Co. on Cortelyou Road, please stop in. It's a great indie bookshop, and I am grateful that Taylor hooked us up with this book and gave me the opportunity to read this incredible book for this interview today. So I figured it was important to shout them out.
Well, for some interborough beef, I live in Queens, New York, And I live in Astoria, and Astoria Bookshop, my local indie bookshop, has signed copies by me.
There you go. Hell yeah.
But wherever you get it is fine.
Well, I live in Manhattan and I don't have a local bookstore, so boo to me.
Before we go, Jordan, can you just let folks know the best and easiest way to grab the book, where they can find you online and your work, and just kind of check out all the cool stuff that you've got going on?
The book is available wherever books are sold. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your library has it probably, or if you ask for it. Go to an indie bookstore and ask for it. Bookshop.org, I think, is what people use as a kind of more like progressive way of buying books. But yeah, it's really wherever books are sold. And then I am Jordan W. Miner on Twitter and Blue Sky and Mastodon and Threads and all the ones that exist, Instagram. And then my day job is writing for PCMag.com. So I review games and technology and all sorts of stuff like that on PC Mag. So if you want to just kind of keep up with my work that way too, that would be great.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Please hang tight. We're going to thank some folks, but really this was an honor and a privilege. I loved your interview on Remap and I reached out immediately. And I'm so glad I did because the book is incredible. I hope that we get other cool, great, and weird stories from your brain in a future book because this has been a delight to read. And I really urge people go pick it up. It's probably one of the best gaming related books I've ever read. So it's definitely worth your time.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Absolutely. Listeners, if you are a fan of video game history, if you are keen on preserving those memories, on hearing from so many others, if you are a longtime listener and you're a fan of our side quest series, this is that done so much better and more professionally in published form. Please get yourself a copy. It's a wonderful book. So with all that being said, please let us know if you've got other great video game history books that are out there, or if you've read Video Game of the Year. A, thank you so much for checking out the book. B, tell us why you think a different game is better or was omitted or anything like that. Bring us the beef first. I'm not going to speak for Jordan on this one, but I'm sure he already fields enough of those questions. But if you heard something on here, or if this got you to read the book, come at us with some of them too. Tell us some of your favorites. Tell us what years should be better represented, not represented. What is your video game of the year from 1977 to 2022? Do that little bit of homework. Handhelds only, whatever else. I will read them. I absolutely will. Don't try me on this because there are so many great ways to get in touch with us with all of that. You can find us across social media at Fun and Games Pod. Whatever form social media takes, when you are listening to this episode, we will be Fun and Games Pod. You can email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought of this episode, previous episodes, who you'd like us to talk to, and what you'd like us to talk about in future episodes. You can go to certainpov.com and find not only a permanent invite link to our Discord server where these sort of discussions continue, but you can also find so many other fantastic Certain POV podcasts. If you are a fan of the show, or if you want to support us in some way and have the desire and means beyond that, you can also visit our Patreon, which is also patreon.com/funandgamespod. All of these episodes are on there publicly, as well as other things that we are developing and finding. But there's other stuff that we work on that patrons can read, and you can also put yourself up on the high scoreboard. And today's high scoreboard is Alex Lavelle, Case Aiken, Daniel Needon, Roger Reichart, Alejandro Alves, Film It Yourself, Patrick Edwards, Rob Tremarco, Robert Proyne, and Sean Bowen. Thank you so much. Please enter in your initials and the game of the year from your year of birth.
That's a lot of pressure.
Well, you only get 30 seconds to put the initials in, so this is just what happens. But I also realized today that we actually have 10 people on the high scoreboards. That really works out.
It's like a real high scoreboard.
It's a real high scoreboard, everybody. It's fantastic.
Also, please rate and review us on your podcast platform of choice, and preferably Apple and Spotify, as those are the ones that get us featured so other folks can find the show. Also, if you're a listener on Spotify and wonder why your feed disappeared, it's because we had 2 feeds for some stupid reason, and a lot of our reviews went to the feed that had to get deleted because it didn't have any of our show art. So if you are listening to this on a different platform but have Spotify, please listen to like 30 seconds to a minute of this episode and rate us so our ratings go back up because we lost a bunch. Technology. But we really appreciate those ratings and reviews. Above and beyond anything else, Patreon, Discord, whatever, it's how we get into more ears and how more people find us. So please go and do that great thing.
It means so much to us that you help get this show out to more people through whatever means, whether it's word of mouth, just by listening, rate, review, Patreon, whatever. We couldn't do this show without you because this is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm at AK Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Do you feel like you're the only person in your circle who wants to go deep about video games regularly?
We were like that too, until now.
Welcome to Crossplay Conversations, the brand new bi-weekly topical video game podcast from Luke Lewis,
Joseph Hooper,
And Jacob McCourt.
with many years of breaking it down separately on shows like the Left Behind Game Club, Player Podcast, and Lukewarm Games, the gang is finally coming together to publish their gaming group chat in audio form every other week.
Expect roundtable reviews of the latest games, profiles of upcoming indies, and insightful conversations about essential topics in the video game industry. All with a mostly positive, insightful, and fun style.
Crossplay Conversations debuts on August 1st with brand new episodes hitting every other Tuesday. Help us out by subscribing on your podcast platform of choice to get the first episodes delivered straight to your feed.
And follow us on Twitter at Crossplay Convos for updates about the show.
Cheers and happy gaming.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.